Children are a gift from the Lord that He gives in His good time. We should not try to explain why it is He has given us the number of children that He has. It's in His will. We also should realize that because it's His will, we cannot go, like Rachel was kind of demanding, we can't go to extraordinary extremes to make sure that we get children if they are not forthcoming. But rather we wait patiently on the Lord in His timing.
So does that go support the Catholics' belief of not using any kind of protection?
What do you mean, the Catholics' belief?
I believe they don't believe in contraceptives. Is that because of God opened and closed the womb?
Is the Catholic belief because God opens and closes the womb? I don't think it's connected to that. I don't think that they would. I think that the Catholic argument is more based on natural law and nature. So it gets more at what is the purpose of marriage? What is the purpose of sexual relations? And so they kind of have this distinction between natural and, I guess what they'd say, unnatural or artificial methods of preventing conception. A lot of people criticize that, though, because when you look at the distinction between natural and unnatural, it seems a little bit flimsy. It seems a little weak. That you can prevent conception in one way, but you can't prevent it in another way. And not everyone is kind of on board with why you can do it in one case and not in another. But I haven't done a whole lot of reading in the Catholic teaching on that, so I don't know how.
Well, what about the church's view on the, intro, where a woman will go in and get, they can't have kids, but then they'll have a doctor help them have kids?
Yeah. In vitro fertilization? Yeah. And that falls under the category, more broadly speaking, of assisted reproductive technologies, ART. And there's over 20 ways to make a baby, not including the good old-fashioned way. But with modern medical technology, there's other ways to make that happen. And actually, the technology, besides the good old-fashioned way, is kind of old, right? Because we see already with Abraham and Sarah, and we read the Bible passage. What did Sarah, because a child was not forthcoming, what was Sarah's solution to that?
Go to the midwife or whatever it was.
Yeah, she had a servant girl named Hagar. And she said, okay, raise up a child for us through my servant girl, which was, according to the custom of that time, that was a legally acceptable way of having a legal child. So that the child would actually have been considered Sarah's. But it amounts to polygamy, basically. So the assisted reproductive technology issue is quite old,
Right. But is that saying that goes against God's will, saying, well, you can't have kids, but I'm going to let man make you be pregnant,
Okay, yeah. So let's go back to the basics here. Be fruitful and multiply, okay? But be fruitful and multiply, that's connected to all of this, right? Remember our marriage stool? Procreation is indeed one of the purposes of marriage. But can it be broken off and isolated from the other purposes? Remember the language? A threefold purpose? Remember that? So are we to isolate any one of these? Is that appropriate to isolate? Okay, why not? What do you think?
Because if you just use one leg, you're ruining the whole three-leg system. You're just relying on one, not all three. if they're not joined together, you're separating it, and it goes against what you just said, they have to stay united.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I'm convinced, based on Scripture, that God has given us these three purposes of marriage. And so, we should pursue them as a unit, as a whole. It's kind of like when Jesus says in Matthew 19, what God has joined together, let not man separate. Now there he's talking about husband and wife and divorce and not divorcing. But I think the principle is legitimate to transfer to other aspects of marriage, not just the longevity of marriage, the lifelong union of marriage, but I think that it's our Lord's intention that this comes together as a unit. What God has joined together, let not man separate. Remember, many of the definitions of marriage and the purpose of marriage include under procreation that it's not just procreation, it's also the nurture of children to be brought up in the fear and nurture of God, the fear and praise of God. So, when you talk about IVF, remember, and we can close with this, IVF includes, it's a whole process, right? I mean, it's not just like a one-and-done thing. There's a whole process, and Dr. Hellstad can probably tell us more about it, but you have to extract the ovum, the oocytes from the wife. The way that kind of the standard medical establishment, my understanding is they fertilize like 20 of these eggs. So you actually have 20 embryos. They grade them based on their fitness, based on their physical appearance under a microscope, how they're judged whether or not they look like they're likely to make it. So if the embryo looks kind of defective, let's get rid of that one. There's a freezing and a thawing process that is involved. You have to freeze these under liquid nitrogen and then thaw them. Both the freezing and the thawing process is a hostile environment for the embryo. A lot of the embryos don't make it. Up to 70% of the embryos don't survive that process of freezing and thawing. Okay, so if you have 20 children, 20 embryos, right? We believe, teach, and confess that the embryo is fully human. It looks different than us. It's younger than us, the embryo is, but it's still fully human. It's a distinct individual human being from conception. So if you have these children under liquid nitrogen, are you actually honoring the purpose of procreation?
Sounds like he's playing God, is what he's trying to do.
But just from I could see what you're saying from the standpoint of you're kind of selecting which embryos seem the fittest. But even that aside, when you talk about putting your children, that's who they are, under liquid nitrogen, can you baptize those children? I mean, if you went through the whole process, but are you going to baptize all 20 of those children? There's almost no chance that you could bring all 20 of them to term, right? So are we really, it's like technically honoring procreation, but is it actually honoring procreation when you add in the idea that you're also supposed to raise your children in the fear of the Lord? And then there's other ethical issues there because it costs money to maintain them in that frozen state. And so a lot of couples, they're looking at the monthly rent, and they're never going to bring all of these children to bear. And so you donate them or you just stop paying, and you can't, they're not under nitrogen anymore. That's the kind of quandary that you get into when you start talking about these things. There's a lot of questions that have to be taken into consideration. But before we get into that, I want to actually circle back to something that we brought up a couple of sessions ago. And the question was asked about assisted reproductive technologies, specifically IVF, in vitro fertilization. And remember, at that time, I advised against IVF because I said that we have this threefold purpose of marriage. It's a unit, it's a unity. And so I was discouraging you from thinking in ways that break off one of the legs or break the connection from one leg to another. There is also the concerns about the safety, the freezing and the thawing of embryos. And of course, that's very dangerous to the life of that young child in embryonic stage. And then there were concerns about raising the children because a lot of those embryos stay under liquid nitrogen and they remain frozen kind of in limbo. But there's also another concern that I would like to quickly address. And that's this whole idea of making children versus begetting children that Oliver O'Donovan addresses in his book by the same namesake, Begotten or Made. Begotten or Made. And of course, you'll recognize that language from the Nicene Creed. We confess that Jesus Christ is the only Son of God. He was begotten, not made. Okay, so he's kind of doing a little bit of a wordplay on the Nicene Creed here, but he's actually talking about this whole mindset of approaching childbearing and thinking about children as a product that is made rather than as a fellow human being that is begotten, that we receive as a gift from God. Another way you could put the difference is it's a shift from procreation to reproduction. Procreation has the idea of partnering with God in creation, whereas reproduction has the idea of a factory, like putting something together on an assembly line. And you hear people say reproduction a lot. It's just a scientific term. But I would encourage you to use the terminology of procreation. It's much more biblical and describes what's actually going on when we talk about childbearing. Another way to put this is it takes the whole topic of childbearing out of the realm of marital relations in the bedroom and it moves it into the laboratory. So it's a way of kind of reducing this marvelous gift down to its component parts in the lab. It's just not very romantic. It's degrading to humanity to have this move from thinking from children as begotten, a fellow human being with us, to just a product that you make in the laboratory, begotten versus made. And we can most clearly see this in the example of in vitro fertilization for the production of embryos to be used in embryo-destructive research. You can do this. Right? Scientists can do this. They can create embryos and use them for research, which research they will not survive. Right? They're not being, these embryos are not being formed so that they can be brought to life, or brought to birth, I should say. They're already alive. But they're being used for research. So this is how O'Donovan summarizes this whole idea, this whole mindset of making children. When we start making human beings, we necessarily stop loving them. That which is made rather than begotten becomes something that we have at our disposal, not someone with whom we can engage in brotherly fellowship. And so this quote encapsulates the difference between begetting and making children. We make children to be used as a product for our benefit. However, in begetting, we receive children as a gift, blessing, and reward from God for brotherly fellowship, a fellow human being we treat as such. And G.K. Chesterton, he actually describes begetting children this way. He uses this analogy. He said, imagine If you were to come to a large city you'd never been to before, right? You don't know anyone in the city. And you were to go and pick a chimney in one of the houses in that city, climb down the chimney, and meet the people in that house, complete strangers to you, and start getting along with them to the best of your ability and live with them for the rest of your life. A complete and total stranger. That is what procreation is like. G.K. Chesterton uses this example. When we receive children from God, we are receiving a fellow human being into our family, warts, imperfections, and sin, and everything that comes with that child. We receive it in a total package, right? And it's much like Chesterton said, just climbing into a random house and then getting along with the people in there. That's what it's like to receive a child through procreation. This is really what procreation is like. We accept the children that come to us, and we receive them as the gift, blessing, and reward that they are from the Lord. So in contrast to this kind of begetting mindset or procreation mindset, in contrast to receiving children as a gift, what do you do with a product that is defective?
Dispose of it.
Dispose of it, okay? What else could you do with a defective product? You get something from the store, right?
Return it.
Return it, yeah. Send it back to the factory. You send it back, discard it, as you would any other defective product, right? So in summary, making children, that mindset where we say that we're making children through IVF or what have you, assisted reproductive technology, when we make children as a product, they are a product that we can use for our benefit, as we would any other factory product. We choose the right one. We get rid of the wrong one. But in begetting children, we receive children as a gift from God for brotherly fellowship, as O'Donovan put it, not as a product to be used. So I share that with you as another kind of concern for, as it stands, relative to these assisted reproductive technologies. Not only are they breaking apart that unity that exists between that threefold purpose of marriage, but it's also treating our fellow human beings as a product that is disposable for our use rather than a gift and a blessing from God. That's O'Donovan's concern, and that he puts forward in Begotten or Made. And if you look at IVF technology, a lot of what he says lines up with how IVF is used.
I don't know why, but I'm having trouble with this. Life is created, and life is provided by God. And there's people that can't have children that want to have children, and providing them a loving family. There's a difference between science and evolution and religion. Yes, God made husband and wife to procreate. But there are people that cannot have children, that the only way they can have children is by doing that or having a surrogate mother. I don't know, I'm having difficulty with this. I think life is created by God, whether it's in vitro fertilization. I don't believe in abortion, I know you don't. I don't know, maybe I'm...
But what he's saying is, they'll start out with 20 embryos, fertilize them all, and then they'll pick the best one and discard the rest. Now, that's kind of like...
What happens to the rest of our eggs and our sperm?
Well, that's why women have the monthly symptoms, because it comes into reproduction, and then it doesn't get seeded, it passes out. That's the way God made us.
Yeah, the embryo is a fully formed, young, human individual. The only difference between us and an embryo is the age. We all started out as an embryo. You mentioned surrogacy, which is kind of what this is. the womb is the petri dish in the lab, essentially, the test tube. So this is a form, it's kind of like a technological form of surrogacy, but you remember, this technology is very old. Remember Abraham and Hagar. What happened with Abraham and Hagar?
I'm not sure.
Abraham and Sarah couldn't have a child. And so Sarah came up with the idea, well, if you take my maidservant Hagar as a concubine, essentially, a second wife, you can raise up children for me. And if you follow the history of Abraham's son through Hagar, Islam actually claims Ishmael as their kind of progenitor. And so because of Abraham and Sarah's weakness, they didn't trust the promise of God to provide them a child through their own marital relation. They created this child, Ishmael, who goes on to be the kind of Islam claims Ishmael as rather than Isaac as their religious kind of lineage goes. And so it's just like with polygamy. You see, when you depart from God's plan, you get off of the tracks and things start to fall apart.
All I can say is thank God there was an abortion when Christ was born. Because, incarnate by the Holy Ghost, and today,
Right.
possibly would have been aborted the fetus.
Yep, and even though Mary and Joseph, they knew the story, not everyone knew that story, right? And Mary would have been looked down upon. Now, just like yesterday, I need to also add the caveat that children born through IVF are gifts and blessings from God. That's not what I'm saying, that they're not. But should we be pursuing this as Christians is the question. And there's grave ethical concerns about this besides the fact that the freezing and the thawing process is extremely dangerous to the life of the child. And that whole process, there's a lot of ethical questions about it. I just want to touch this, though, that gets at this whole idea that we're making children to be used as a product. And it's turning children into a commodity through this whole, it's not just IVF, it's the entire assisted reproductive technology enterprise. Very much is making children a product to be almost bought and sold.
I still believe, though, that God created that life.
Yes?
And I guess I'm not going to question others that choose to do that. It's not my place. It's God's choice on what happens with those children. And there's many parents that have children through IVF that would never been able to bear children. And it's a blessing for them to be able to have a family and procreate and to enjoy their children. We have children that are born with handicaps and disabilities, and we still love them and take care of them.
Yep, this has nothing to do with their love. As I mentioned, the child is a gift and a blessing from God. There's many different ways to make a baby. You could make children through fornication, or you could procreate children. I was just talking about the making mindset. You could have children through fornication, through adultery. All of those children their life is a gift and a blessing, but that doesn't excuse the fornication, right?
Right.
So there's more than one consideration. We also talked about the religious instruction of the children, and Jonathan mentioned that just by the very nature of this process, you're making 10, 20 children at a time. You're not going to possibly bring all of them to birth. Not one couple, not one woman. That's not possible. even if you dedicate your whole life to doing that. So what do you do with the children who are frozen? There's a lot of ethical issues that are very grave when it comes to this. So, given that procreation is a matter of God's will, right? It's he who chooses when to give life, when to open and close the womb, and children are a gift. And in addition, the threefold purpose of marriage is a unit or a whole. Pastorally speaking, I would counsel couples not to use IVF for all of those reasons that we just talked about. And this is kind of a big topic, so I don't want to just cut it off there. Are there any questions or comments or thoughts on that?
So as a pastor, would you counsel them to consider adoption? Is that what? Or would you just say it's God's will not to have children, or how would you approach that?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're talking about a couple who can't have children, a lot of times what will happen is they'll start to consider adoption. Now, a huge advantage of adoption over something like IVF is that you're talking about a child who's already born, who already needs, I mean, if you're talking about adoption, they need parents, right? So IVF, you're bringing additional children into the world when maybe, just maybe, it might be God's will that you take on a child that needs parents for whatever reason, their family broke down, and now they need other parents to raise them. You could also accept barrenness and infertility as a cross. It's going to be a cross either way. But you could say, well, maybe the Lord has kind of opened up a door for us to serve in other ways that we wouldn't be able to do if we had children. Because children are a huge commitment. You can't do things as easily or as readily with children as you can without. So you could really, go either path, and either way would be a godly option. I will also say about adoption is that we all have experience with adoption. We all have experience with adoption because we are not born automatically in God's family. Right? Because of sin and the fall into sin, we're born in the kingdom of darkness and original sin and all these things. We need to be adopted into God's family. So actually, adoption is a way of sharing the Christian love that you have been shown in your baptism when God adopted you into his family. You're not a child by virtue of being begotten of God. You're a child by being adopted into God's family. The only one who's begotten of God is God the Son, Jesus Christ. So yeah, I agree. I think that in those cases, a godly Christian couple should and can consider adoption. One of the things that kind of happens sometimes is a lot of couples, when they do the adoption process, then they also get pregnant. And then they have a biological child as well. I hear of that happening quite a bit. Nevertheless, it's God's timing and God's will when and where he blesses us with children. Even in adoption as well. It's not a guaranteed thing that you'll get a child through adoption. I believe you have experience with that, Bob and Deb. So feel free to share any experience that you'd like on that or your thoughts.
Well, we didn't think we could have kids. We'd been married for several years. And so we applied for adoption, went through the study and everything. And we said that we would like a little older child, and like 2 or 3 maybe. And they said, well, you'll probably get your baby first, because all the others wanted infants, and so you
Uh-huh.
will get yours. And they all got theirs, and we still didn't have ours.
Oh, really?
And it ended up being 5 years before we finally got her, and they said it'll be about the same amount of time as a pregnancy. You should all have your baby in about 9 months. But it took 5 years because the right one hadn't come along.
Yeah, it's a roller coaster.
It was. And in the meantime, we lost one, had a
Okay.
miscarriage, and had one, our own, yes. Actually, as we did the study, I got pregnant. And so we had Scott, that's why we wanted one a little older, so that he would be closer to this one. And it just wasn't in God's plan. There was supposed to be a bigger space.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, that gets into the realm of adoption. It's hard, you know? It's not just like it's an easy solution. That's what I hear you saying, Deb.
It was a lot of up and down, and I would go into the adoption agency and she'd say, well, we're just so far behind, and so I thought, well, what do you guys need? And so they said, well, we haven't filed all these children's pictures and all this, and so I was doing all of this stuff so that they could get our paperwork sent in, and they just couldn't do it. And we finally called down to the state and said, they're telling us this. But, and they said, oh, that's not right. No, they should send that in right away, your paperwork, because it was horrible. But we finally got her, and she's 31 now, has a little 9-year-old herself. And so.
Praise God, that's awesome. Well, and yeah, you had your children of your own too after that, so yeah. It's interesting, it's kind of funny how that works sometimes. And just as a reminder, tomorrow we're meeting at St. John's in Black River Falls to continue this. We'll wrap up with the procreation section, and we'll get on to the next purpose of marriage after that.